starting to crack around the edges. And I could practically see the gears turning in her head as she tried to figure out how the hell the meeting had gotten away from her this quickly. Sabrina, on the other hand, looked like someone had just told her Christmas was cancelled and her trust fund had been donated to charity. The smirk that had been permanently attached to her face for the past 3 weeks had vanished completely, replaced by an expression that was somewhere between confusion and pure unadulterated panic. What is this? Clara finally managed to say, her voice carrying just the tiniest tremor that told me I'd succeeded in rattling her cage in a way that probably hadn't happened since her first board meeting 20 years ago. Those are divorce papers, I said helpfully, like I was explaining basic math to a particularly slow kindergartner. You know, the legal documents that officially end a marriage when one party decides to throw the other party out of their shared home based on completely fabricated accusations. I kept my voice pleasant and conversational, the same tone I'd use to discuss the weather or ask someone to pass the salt. Professional courtesy, you might call it. After all, we were in a business setting, and I believed in maintaining appropriate workplace decorum, even when I was systematically destroying someone's assumptions about how this conversation was going to go. Clara picked up the papers with hands that were definitely not as steady as they've been 5 minutes ago. Her eyes started scanning the first page, and I watched her face go through a fascinating series of expressions as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Confusion gave way to shock. Shock gave way to disbelief, and disbelief was rapidly approaching something that looked suspiciously like the early stages of pure terror. Marcus, she said slowly, like she was trying to talk a jumpy horse into not throwing her off a cliff. Surely, we can discuss this like adults. There's no need for lawyers and legal proceedings. We can work something out privately. Privately. Translation, she wanted to negotiate this mess behind closed doors where she could control the narrative and minimize the damage to her reputation, where she could spin it as a mutual decision instead of the train wreck it actually was. Oh, we absolutely can discuss this like adults. I agreed cheerfully. In fact, that's exactly what we're doing right now. You're an adult. I'm an adult. And these are adult consequences for adult decisions. Funny how that works, isn't it? Sabrina had been unusually quiet during this exchange, which should have been my first warning that she was about to do something spectacularly stupid, but I was so focused on watching Clara's world crumble in real time that I didn't notice the storm brewing in the cheap seats until it was too late. You can't do this. Sabrina suddenly exploded, slamming her manicured hand down on the table hard enough to make the water glasses jump. You can't just waltz in here and destroy my sister's life because you got caught red-handed. And there it was. The mask was completely off now. And Sabrina was showing her true colors in all their ugly, manipulative glory. Gone was the concerned sister act. The subtle poison whispered in Clara's ear. This was pure, undiluted rage from someone who just realized that her carefully constructed house of lies was about to come tumbling down around her ears. Caught red-handed doing what exactly? I asked, turning to look at her directly for the first time since this whole circus had started. Please enlighten me. What exactly was I caught doing? You know what you did? She shrieked, her voice hitting a pitch that probably had dogs howling 3 blocks away. The affairs, the money, the lies. Which affairs? I interrupted calmly. The ones where I was supposedly seen at Cafe Milano when I was actually in a conference room with witnesses who can verify my whereabouts. Or maybe you're talking about the mysterious blonde woman who turned out to be a barista at Starbucks who can't spell my name correctly on a coffee cup. Sabrina's face was turning an interesting shade of red that clashed horribly with her designer outfit. The money transfers, the secret accounts, the you mean my anniversary savings account. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app with theatrical precision. The one labeled Anniversary Fund Italy trip that I was using to surprise Clara with a romantic vacation. Would you like to see the screenshots or should I just email them directly to Clara's legal team? This was the beautiful thing about dealing with pathological liars. They never expect you to have actual facts to back up your side of the story. They get so used to operating in a world of whispered suggestions and manufactured drama that they forget normal people keep records of things like bank statements and work schedules. Clara was still reading through the divorce papers, and I could tell she'd gotten to the really interesting parts because her face had gone from pale to absolutely ghostly. She was looking at the prenup clauses, the ones that spelled out in excruciating legal detail exactly what happened when a marriage ended due to unreasonable behavior on the part of the wealthy spouse. Unreasonable behavior like refusing to investigate accusations before acting on them. Like throwing your spouse out of the marital home without cause. Like prioritizing the word of a financially dependent family member over the person you'd promised to love, honor, and trust until death do you part. Marcus, Clara said quietly. And for the first time in months, she sounded like the woman I'd married instead of the who'd been interrogating me over dinner for weeks. These clauses, I don't remember agreeing to these terms. You insisted on them, I reminded her gently. You said you wanted me to feel secure in our marriage. You said you never wanted me to worry that you might use your wealth as a weapon against me if things got difficult. The irony was so thick, you could have used it to pave roads. Clara had been so concerned about protecting me from hypothetical future Clara that she'd accidentally created a legal safety net for exactly this situation. Sabrina was reading over Clara's shoulder now, and I watched her face go from red to white to an interesting shade of green as she realized what those highlighted sections actually meant. Her sister, her meal ticket, her source of income, her entire lifestyle was about to become significantly less wealthy. And it was all because of the lies Sabrina herself had planted. Clara, you can't sign this, Sabrina whispered urgently. There has to be another way. You can fight it. You can fight what? Clara asked, and her voice sounded hollow and defeated. Fight the prenup I insisted on. Fight the documented evidence that Marcus wasn't actually cheating. Fight the fact that I threw my husband out of our home based on accusations I never bothered to verify. She looked up at me and for a moment I saw a flash of the woman I'd fallen in love with 4 years ago. The one who was brilliant and successful but also vulnerable and uncertain beneath all that corporate armor. How much? She asked quietly. I pretended to think about it for a moment even though I'd memorized every single clause and calculation weeks ago. According to the prenup you drafted and given the circumstances of our separation, the monthly alimony comes out to roughly 30% of your net income for the next 5 years with a lump sum payment of $2.4 million to be paid within 60 days of the divorce decree. Sabrina made a sound like she was choking on her own tongue. $2.4 million. Clara, you can't afford that. The business, the expenses, the gambling debts, I suggested helpfully. Oh yes, we'll definitely need to discuss those. Both women went very, very still. Even the air in the room seemed to stop moving, like the entire building was holding its breath to see what would happen next. Gambling debts, Clara repeated slowly. And that's when I knew I had them exactly where I wanted them. Time for the real fun to begin. You ever watch a controlled demolition on TV? You know, where they blow up an old building and it comes down in slow motion, floor by floor, until there's nothing left but dust and debris. That's exactly what happened to Sabrina Whitmore's composure when I dropped the words gambling debts into that conference room like a stick of dynamite with a very short fuse. The transformation was honestly spectacular. 1 second she was sitting there trying to look like the concerned sister, still clinging to the last shreds of her victim act. And the next second, she was launching herself out of her chair like someone had just electrified the upholstery. You bastard, she screamed. And I mean screamed. The kind of sound that probably sent every dog in a 5-block radius running for cover. You lying, manipulative bastard. You can't prove anything. Ah, but there's the beautiful thing about gambling addicts, especially the kind who think they're smarter than everyone else. They leave a trail of evidence longer than the receipt from a Black Friday shopping spree at Macy's. And when that evidence involves stealing money from your sister's business accounts to feed your addiction, well, that trail becomes less like breadcrumbs and more like neon highway markers pointing straight to federal prison. Clara was staring at Sabrina like she'd never seen her before in her life. Gambling debts. Sabrina, what is he talking about? Nothing. Sabrina shot back, but her voice had gone up about 3 octaves, which is generally not what innocent people sound like when they're denying accusations. He's making it up. He's trying to deflect from his own crimes by my own crimes. I interrupted, reaching back into my magical briefcase of truth bombs. You mean like this? I pulled out a manila folder that was thick enough to choke a horse and placed it gently on the table between us. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the air conditioning humming in the vents overhead. These are bank statements, I said conversationally, like I was discussing the weather instead of about to destroy someone's entire life. Not mine, obviously, since you've already established that my finances are an open book. These are from several offshore accounts that were opened using Clara's business credit and social security number. Clara's face went from pale to absolutely ghostly. What are you talking about, Marcus? Well, it's interesting, I continued, opening the folder and spreading out the documents with the kind of care usually reserved for handling ancient manuscripts. It seems someone has been making regular transfers from Whitmore Luxury Real Estate's operating accounts into these offshore holdings for the past 18 months. Small amounts at first, 5,000 here, 10,000 there, but gradually increasing in frequency and size. Sabrina was standing now, backing away from the table like the papers were radioactive. You can't. That's not. How did I get these? I smiled at her with all the warmth of a shark who'd just spotted a wounded seal. Funny thing about being married to a CEO. You pick up a few contacts in the financial investigation business. Turns out, when you pay the right people enough money, they can trace just about any financial irregularity back to its source. I pulled out another sheet. This one with highlighted sections that looked like a Christmas tree had exploded all over it. This particular account shows regular withdrawals at various casinos in Atlantic City, Las Vegas, and my personal favorite, an online poker site called Lucky Lady's Last Chance. Really classy name, by the way. Very subtle. Clara was reading over my shoulder now, her breathing getting shallow and quick like someone was slowly squeezing all the air out of the room. Sabrina, please tell me this isn't what it looks like. It's not what it looks like. Sabrina shrieked, but she was still backing toward the door like she was planning to make a run for it. He's fabricated all of this. He's trying to frame me because he knows he's caught. That's when I pulled out my phone and opened up the photo gallery with the kind of theatrical flourish that would have made Shakespeare proud. You know, Sabrina, for someone who's supposedly being framed, you sure do take a lot of selfies at casino tables. The photos were beautiful. Really crystal clear shots of Sabrina living her best life at blackjack tables, slot machines, and poker games, all tagged with locations and timestamps that corresponded perfectly with the dates of the mysterious account withdrawals. Social media had been her downfall. She'd been so proud of her high roller lifestyle that she documented every single gambling session like she was creating evidence for her own prosecution. These are from your Instagram account. I explained helpfully to Clara, who was staring at the photos like they were pictures of her sister committing murder. Apparently, Sabrina thought her gambling adventures were worth sharing with the world. Very civic-minded of her. Really made my investigator's job much easier. Clara's voice was barely above a whisper. You stole from my company. You stole from me. I didn't steal anything. Sabrina was full-on hyperventilating now. Her designer dress sticking to her with sweat despite the air conditioning that was probably set to Arctic. It was just borrowing. I was going to pay it back. I was on a winning streak. And a winning streak. I laughed and I'll admit it wasn't a particularly nice laugh. According to these records, you've lost approximately $473,000 over the past 18 months. If that's a winning streak, I'd hate to see what you consider a losing streak. The number hit Clara like a physical blow. She actually staggered backward and had to grab the edge of the conference table to keep herself upright. $473,000. Sabrina, that's almost half our emergency operating fund. It would have been more, I added cheerfully. But the accounts got flagged by the fraud prevention system last month. Turns out banks get suspicious when someone suddenly starts making large transfers to offshore gambling sites. Who knew? That's when Sabrina completely lost what was left of her mind. She started screaming, not words, just pure inarticulate rage. And before anyone could react, she grabbed the water pitcher from the conference table and hurled it at me with the kind of accuracy that suggested she'd been practicing. I ducked. The picture shattered against the wall behind me in a very satisfying explosion of glass and water. And suddenly, the conference room looked like a hurricane had blown through it. You destroyed everything, she screamed, advancing on me with her hands curved into claws like she was planning to scratch my eyes out. Everything I worked for. Everything I built. Everything you built. Clara's voice cut through the chaos like a sword through silk. You built nothing, Sabrina. You've never worked a day in your life. You've been living off my money, stealing from my company, and apparently lying to me about everything for years. The sisters were facing each other now across the wreckage of the conference room, and the family resemblance had never been clearer. They had the same bone structure, the same general build, but Clara looked like strength and determination, while Sabrina looked like those qualities had been twisted into something desperate and ugly. I protected you from him. Sabrina shrieked, pointing at me like I was the devil himself. He was using you. He was going to take everything you worked for. The only person who's been taking everything I worked for is you. Clara shot back and her voice had that cutting edge that made her opponents in business negotiations break out in cold sweats. You've been robbing me blind while telling me my husband was the criminal. I decided this was probably a good time to interject before someone ended up needing medical attention. Clara, I think we should call security and probably the police. Embezzlement is a felony and assault with a water pitcher is at least a misdemeanor. The word police seemed to snap Sabrina back to something resembling reality. She stopped advancing on me and started looking around the room like she was just now realizing how completely screwed she was. CL, please, she said. And suddenly, her voice was small and desperate instead of angry. I'm your sister. Family, we can work this out. I can get help. I can go to therapy, join Gamblers Anonymous, whatever you want. Just don't. Don't what? Clara interrupted. Don't hold you accountable for stealing from me. Don't expect you to face consequences for destroying my marriage. Don't demand answers for why you've been systematically lying to me for months. The fight went out of Sabrina all at once like someone had pulled her plug. She collapsed back into her chair and started crying. Not the pretty, delicate tears of a movie heroine, but the ugly, snotty, mascara-running kind of crying that people do when their entire world falls apart in the span of 10 minutes. Clara looked at her sister for a long moment, then turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Marcus, she said quietly, I owe you an apology. A very big apology, but I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Actually, Clara, I said, gathering up my papers with deliberate care. I think what you owe me is a signature on those divorce papers. The real reckoning was just getting started. You know what they say about truth being stranger than fiction? Well, let me tell you. After spending 3 weeks digging into Sabrina Whitmore's financial activities, I was starting to think whoever came up with that saying had clearly never met someone whose entire life was built on a foundation of lies, theft, and what I can only describe as weaponized incompetence. But here's the thing about people like Sabrina. They never commit just one crime. They're like potato chips of criminal behavior. You can't steal just once. And while I was watching her have her dramatic meltdown in Clara's conference room, I realized I hadn't even gotten to the really juicy stuff yet. My lawyer had outdone himself. The man was like a financial archaeologist, digging through layers of deception to uncover artifacts of fraud that would have impressed the FBI's white-collar crime division. While Sabrina was still blubbering in her chair and Clara was staring at her sister like she'd never seen her before, I reached back into my briefcase one more time. Actually, I said, pulling out yet another folder that was even thicker than the first one. The gambling addiction is just the tip of the iceberg. Clara looked at me with eyes that were already so wide they were in danger of falling out of her head. There's more. Oh, honey, there's so much more. I opened the new folder with the kind of reverence usually reserved for handling nuclear material. See, when you hire a really good financial investigator, and I mean really good, the kind who charges more per day than most people make in a month, they don't just look at the obvious stuff. They dig deeper. They follow paper trails that most people don't even know exist. Sabrina had stopped crying and was now staring at me with the kind of horror usually reserved for people who've just realized they're in a horror movie and they're definitely not the final girl. What I discovered, I continued, spreading out documents like I was laying down a winning hand in the world's most expensive poker game, is that our dear Sabrina here has been running what you might call a diversified portfolio of fraud. The first document was a credit report that looked like it had been through a paper shredder and reassembled by someone having a nervous breakdown. Credit cards opened in Clara's name, 17 of them to be exact, with a combined limit of just over $600,000. Clara's face went through a fascinating series of expressions like she was cycling through every stage of grief simultaneously. Credit cards in my name all maxed out naturally, I said cheerfully. The monthly payments have been automatically deducted from Whitmore Luxury Real Estate's accounts for the past 2 years. Your accounting department probably thought they were legitimate business expenses. I pulled out another sheet. This one covered in so many colored highlights it looked like a rainbow had exploded on it. Then there are the loans, personal loans, business loans. Something called a luxury lifestyle advance from a company that I'm pretty sure is just 3 guys in a basement somewhere who charge interest rates that would make loan sharks blush. Sabrina was making small whimpering sounds now, like a dog that knows it's about to get taken to the vet for something unpleasant. Clara, on the other hand, was getting that focused look she got when she was about to destroy someone in a business negotiation. How much? Clara asked, and her voice had gone completely flat and emotionless, which anyone who knew her would recognize as a very, very bad sign. I pretended to consult my notes, even though I had these numbers memorized down to the penny. Well, if we include the gambling losses, the credit card debt, the various loans, and the compound interest on everything, we're looking at approximately $1.20 $2 million in total debt that's been systematically transferred onto your personal and business credit. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the elevator dinging in the hallway outside. Clara was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language, and Sabrina looked like she was seriously considering whether jumping out the 15th floor window would be preferable to whatever was about to happen next. But wait, there was more. Because when you're dealing with someone who spent years perfecting the art of financial parasitism, you don't stop at simple theft. You branch out into more creative endeavors. Oh, and then there's the real estate, I said, pulling out what looked like a stack of property deeds and mortgage documents. Turns out Sabrina has been quite the entrepreneur in the property investment business. Clara's head snapped up. What property? 3 condos in Miami, a beach house in the Hamptons, and this is my personal favorite, a timeshare in Aspen that apparently comes with its own private ski instructor. I spread out the paperwork with the kind of care usually reserved for handling evidence at a crime scene. All purchased using loans that were secured against Whitmore Luxury Real Estate's assets. That's impossible, Clara said. But her voice lacked conviction. I would have had to sign off on any loans using company assets as collateral. I pulled out a magnifying glass. Yes, I actually brought a magnifying glass because sometimes you have to lean into the drama and handed it to her along with one of the documents. Take a look at the signature line. Clara examined the signature under magnification and I watched her face go from confusion to understanding to pure undiluted rage in the span of about 10 seconds. This is my signature, she said quietly. Technically, yes, I agreed. But unless you've developed a sudden interest in timeshares and beach houses that you forgot to mention, I'm guessing you didn't actually sign these documents. Forgery. We'd officially moved from simple theft into federal crime territory. And judging by the look on Sabrina's face, she was starting to realize that her problems had just escalated from awkward family dinner conversation to potentially spending the next decade in an orange jumpsuit. "Sabrina," Clara said, and her voice was so cold it could have frozen nitrogen. "Did you forge my signature?" "I can explain." Sabrina burst out, finally finding her voice now that she was staring down the barrel of serious jail time. "It wasn't supposed to be permanent. I was going to pay everything back. The timeshare was an investment. The condos were appreciating in value. It was all going to work out." "You forged my signature to steal over $1 million, Clara said slowly, like she was testing each word to make sure it was real. "You destroyed my marriage with lies while you were robbing me blind. You've been living off my money, sleeping in a bed I paid for, eating food I bought, while systematically destroying everything I've worked for." The breakdown of their relationship was happening in real time. And it was honestly beautiful to watch. 28 years of sisterly bonds built on trust and family loyalty and shared childhood memories crumbling under the weight of documented evidence that Sabrina had been treating Clara like her personal ATM for years. "Clara, I'm your sister," Sabrina wailed, playing her last card with all the desperation of someone who's just realized they're holding a losing hand. "Family blood. That has to count for something." "You're right," Clara said, standing up slowly and walking over to where Sabrina was cowering in her chair. "It does count for something. It makes what you've done so much worse." She picked up her phone and started dialing. "Who are you calling?" Sabrina asked, though I think we all knew the answer. "The police," Clara said calmly, "and then my lawyer, and then my accountant, and then probably the FBI, because I'm pretty sure what you've done crosses state lines, which makes it a federal crime." Sabrina started crying again, but this time it wasn't the angry, frustrated crying from before. This was the kind of desperate, hopeless crying that people do when they realize their entire life has just imploded and there's no way to put the pieces back together. Clara looked at me across the wreckage of the conference room, across the destroyed remains of our marriage and her relationship with her sister, and for the first time in months, I saw something in her eyes that looked like respect. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." I waited. "Is there any chance at all, that we could find a way to fix this?" And that's when I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. You know that moment in every revenge movie where the hero has the villain exactly where they want them, and you're sitting there waiting to see if they're going to show mercy or deliver the killing blow? Well, let me tell you something about real life. Sometimes the most devastating thing you can do to someone isn't destruction. Sometimes it's just walking away and letting them live with the consequences of their own choices. Clara was looking at me with those big, desperate eyes that had once made melt like butter on hot toast. The same eyes that had convinced me to propose, that had made me believe I was the luckiest guy in the world when she said yes. That had looked at me with such love and trust during our wedding ceremony, that I'd actually teared up in front of 300 of Manhattan's most influential people. Now those same eyes were pleading with me to save her from the wreckage of her own making. "Is there any chance we could fix this?" she'd asked, and the hope in her voice was so fragile. It was practically heartbreaking. Almost. I stood up slowly, gathering my papers with the same methodical care I'd used throughout this entire spectacular show. Every document went back into its proper folder. Every folder went back into the briefcase. Every piece of evidence that had just demolished her world packed away neat and tidy like I was cleaning up after a particularly successful business presentation. "Fix this," I repeated, testing the words like I was trying to figure out what language she was speaking. "CL, honey, I'm not sure you understand what this actually is anymore." Behind her, Sabrina had finally managed to stop crying long enough to pay attention to our conversation, and I could see the desperate calculation in her eyes. She was probably thinking that if Clara and I got back together, maybe she could somehow wiggle out of the legal nightmare she'd created for herself. Maybe Big Sister would protect her one more time, cover for her crimes, find a way to make all the bad stuff disappear like it always had before. Too bad for Sabrina that those days were officially over. "I know I made mistakes," Clara said. And credit where credit's due. She was trying to maintain some dignity even though her entire world was collapsing around her ears. "I know I trusted the wrong person. I know I should have believed you instead of," she gestured vaguely at her sister who was still huddled in her chair like a designer-dressed gargoyle. "Instead of me," I finished for her. "Instead of your husband, instead of the man you promised to love, honor, and trust until death do us part. Instead of the guy who spent 3 years of his life building a relationship with you while your sister was systematically robbing you blind and poisoning your mind against me." Each word hit her like a physical blow. And I could see her flinch with every accusation. But here's the thing about consequences. They don't care about your feelings. They don't care how sorry you are or how much you regret your choices. They just exist heavy and permanent and utterly unforgiving. "Marcus, please," she said. And there was real pain in her voice now. "I was wrong. I was so wrong about everything. But we can start over. We can rebuild. I'll make it right. Start over. Like the past 3 months had been some kind of minor disagreement instead of a complete character assassination orchestrated by the person she'd chosen to trust over me. Like, I could just forget the night she'd thrown me out of our home like garbage. The weeks of silence, the absolute certainty in her voice when she told me that Sabrina wouldn't lie to her about something so important. How exactly are you planning to make it right, Clara? I asked, closing the briefcase with a satisfying click that seemed to echo through the destroyed conference room. Are you going to give me back the 3 years I spent married to someone who was willing to believe the worst about me without a shred of evidence? Are you going to undo the humiliation of being kicked out of my own home? Are you going to somehow erase the fact that when push came to shove, you chose your lying, stealing, manipulative sister over the husband who'd never given you any reason not to trust him? The questions hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. And I could see Clara scrambling for answers that didn't exist. Because that's the thing about trust. Once it's broken, really truly broken, all the apologies in the world can't put it back together again. You can say you're sorry. You can promise to do better. You can even mean it with every fiber of your being. But you can unknow what you learned about someone's character when they showed you who they really were in a crisis. And Clara had shown me exactly who she was when things got difficult. She was someone who would throw away 3 years of marriage based on the word of a person who'd been lying to her about everything else in her life. That wasn't the kind of person I wanted to be married to anymore. I love you, she said desperately, playing her last card with all the finesse of someone who just realized the deck was stacked against them. I know I screwed up, but I love you, Marcus. That has to count for something. I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had been the center of my universe for 3 years. This brilliant, successful, powerful who could negotiate million-old deals in her sleep, but couldn't see through her own sister's pathetically obvious lies. And I felt nothing. No anger, no hurt, no residual love trying to pull me back into the disaster she'd created. Just a vast empty sense of being done with all of it. You know what, Clara? I actually believe that you think you love me, but here's what I've learned about your version of love. It's conditional. It depends on other people's opinions. It evaporates the moment someone whispers something ugly in your ear. That's not love, sweetheart. That's just convenience with feelings attached. Sabrina tried to interject, probably hoping to salvage something from this train wreck, but I held up a hand that stopped her cold. And you, I said, turning to look at her directly. You don't get to say a goddamn word. You've done enough talking for one lifetime. Security will be here soon to escort you out, and then you get to spend the next few years explaining to various law enforcement agencies exactly how you thought stealing over $1 million from your sister was a reasonable life choice. I picked up my briefcase and walked toward the door, leaving both women sitting in the wreckage of their relationship and Clara's business empire. But just before I reached the exit, Clara called out one last time, Marcus, please don't leave like this. I was wrong about everything, but we can fix it. We can go to counseling. We can work through this. I'll do anything. I stopped with my hand on the door handle and turned back to look at her one final time. She was crying now, silent tears that tracked down her cheeks and probably cost more than most people's monthly salary and ruined makeup. And for just a second, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. You want to know the really sad part about all of this, Clara? I said quietly. If you had just asked me about any of those accusations, if you had just given me the chance to defend myself instead of deciding I was guilty based on your sister's word, none of this would have happened. Your marriage would be intact, your business would be secure, and Sabrina would still be your problem to deal with instead of the FBI's. I opened the door and the sounds of normal office life drifted in from the hallway, phones ringing, people having ordinary conversations about ordinary problems, the blessed mundane reality of a world where people weren't destroying each other's lives over fabricated betrayals. But you chose to trust her instead of me, I continued. You chose to believe the worst about the person who'd never given you any reason to doubt him. And now you get to live with the consequences of that choice. I walked out of that conference room, out of Clara's office building, out of the life I'd built with someone who'd turned out to be a stranger wearing the face of the woman I'd loved. Behind me, I could hear Sabrina starting to wail again and Clara trying to calm her down, but their voices faded as I made my way to the elevator. The doors closed with a soft ding. And as I watched the floor numbers count down toward ground level, I realized something that surprised me. I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I was free. You know how they say revenge is a dish best served cold? Well, let me tell you something about that particular piece of wisdom. It's absolutely true. But what they don't mention is that the best revenge isn't actually revenge at all. Sometimes the most satisfying outcome is just watching the universe handle your enemies for you while you're busy building a better life somewhere else. It's been 6 months since I walked out of Clara's conference room, and I've got to say, the view from my new reality is pretty damn spectacular. I'm sitting in my new office. Not the cramped downtown shoebox I'd been hiding in during the divorce proceedings, but a legitimate office with windows that actually open and a coffee maker that doesn't sound like it's having an existential crisis every time I use it. The sign on the door reads, "Hail Project Solutions," and business has been better than I ever imagined possible. Turns out when you spend 3 years married to one of the most connected women in the city's business community, you pick up a few contacts of your own. And when those contacts hear that you're newly single and available for freelance project management work, and they've always thought you were the brains behind some of Clara's more successful ventures anyway, well, let's just say my phone started ringing pretty much the day after the divorce was finalized. The irony is beautiful. Really, Clara used to joke that I was her secret weapon in negotiations. The guy who could spot problems before they became disasters and keep complicated projects running smoothly. She thought she was being complimentary, but what she was actually doing was advertising my skills to every major player in Manhattan's business scene. Now, those same people are my clients, and I'm making more money in 6 months as a consultant than I made in 2 years as a salaried project manager. Turns out my middle-class work ethic and attention to detail are pretty valuable commodities when they're not being overshadowed by someone else's trust, fund, and family connections. But the real satisfaction isn't the money or the success or even the vindication of knowing I was right all along. The real satisfaction is watching Clara's empire crumble in real time while I'm building something solid and sustainable with my own 2 hands. The news started trickling in about a month after I left. Dave from my old job called me up, barely able to contain his excitement as he filled me in on the latest gossip from the Manhattan business community. "Dude, you're not going to believe this," he'd said. "But Clara's company is imploding. The fraud investigation, the missing money, the bad press. Investors are bailing left and right. It started with the banks. Once they realized the extent of Sabrina's financial crimes, they began calling in loans and freezing accounts faster than you could say embezzlement. Clara found herself dealing with the kind of cash flow problems that would make a small business owner break out in cold sweats. Except she was trying to manage it while running a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. Then came the clients. Wealthy people don't like uncertainty and they really don't like doing business with companies that make headlines for all the wrong reasons. When news broke that Whitmore Luxury Real Estate CEO had been systematically robbed by her own sister for nearly 2 years without noticing, it didn't exactly inspire confidence in Clara's business judgment. The shareholders were next. Board meetings turned into bloodbaths with investors demanding explanations Clara couldn't provide and answers she didn't have. How do you tell a room full of people who trusted you with their money that you were so busy listening to lies about your husband that you completely missed the fact that your sister was stealing them blind? The final nail in the coffin was the regulatory investigation. When federal agencies start looking into your business practices, it doesn't matter how innocent you are. The mere existence of an investigation is enough to scare away anyone who might have been willing to stick around through the financial problems and the bad press. Within 4 months, Clara had gone from Manhattan real estate royalty to just another failed. So, looking for a buyer willing to take over her debt-ridden company for pennies on the dollar. The personal toll was even more spectacular to watch from a distance. Clara had to sell the penthouse, the same penthouse she'd thrown me out of with such righteous certainty. She downsized to a modest apartment in Queens, which must have felt like being exiled to Siberia for someone who'd spent her entire adult life living in Manhattan luxury. The social circle she'd cultivated so carefully over the years evaporated overnight. Turns out, when you're no longer useful to people who only valued your connections and your ability to host expensive dinner parties, those friendships disappear faster than free drinks at a wedding reception. But the real kicker, the absolute cherry on top of this poetic justice Sunday, was what happened to Sabrina. My lawyer kept me updated on her legal proceedings with the kind of professional glee usually reserved for people who just won the lottery. Federal charges for wire fraud, identity theft, and embezzlement across state lines. The kind of charges that come with mandatory minimum sentences and the distinct possibility of spending the next decade explaining to federal prison inmates why you thought stealing from your sister was a reasonable career choice. Sabrina tried to make a deal. Of course, she offered to testify against Clara, claiming that her sister had been complicit in the financial schemes all along. But here's the problem with being a pathological liar who spent years manipulating everyone around you. When you finally need people to believe you, you discover that your credibility account is completely overdrawn. The prosecutors weren't interested in her testimony because they couldn't trust anything that came out of her mouth. Her own defense attorney reportedly described her as the least reliable witness in the history of federal criminal proceedings. And Clara, despite everything Sabrina had put her through, refused to throw her sister completely under the bus, which meant Sabrina couldn't even get a deal by fully cooperating. She got 8 years in federal prison, and from what I hear, she's not adjusting well to life without credit cards and personal shoppers. Clara tried reaching out to me a few times during those chaotic months. Voicemails that started apologetic and gradually became more desperate as her situation deteriorated. Text messages that range from, "I hope you're doing well," to, Please, I need to talk to someone who understands what really happened. I ignored every single one, not out of spite, though I'll admit spite played a small role in my decision-making process. I ignored them because I genuinely had nothing to say to her. What was I supposed to do? Offer comfort to the woman who destroyed our marriage based on lies? Provide business advice to someone who demonstrated such spectacularly poor judgment? Pretend that 3 years of my life hadn't been wasted on someone who valued her sister's manipulation over her husband's honesty? The final paperwork for our divorce was signed on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 year after she'd thrown me out of the penthouse. I met her at the courthouse, neutral ground, lawyers present, everything official and impersonal. She looked smaller than I remembered, worn down by months of stress and financial pressure and the kind of social isolation that comes from being publicly humiliated in a very small, very gossipy business community. "Marcus," she said as we waited for the judge to process the final documents, "I want you to know that I understand now about everything about what she did to us, about what I did to us. I understand that I destroyed the best thing in my life because I was too proud and too stupid to see what was right in front of me." I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in months, and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, no residual affection. She was just a stranger who happened to share some unpleasant history with me. "I know you do," I said quietly. "But understanding what you did wrong doesn't undo the damage. It doesn't give me back the 3 years I spent married to someone who was willing to believe the worst about me without evidence. It doesn't change the fact that when our marriage was tested, you chose your sister over me. If I could take it all back, but you can't." I interrupted gently. "And that's the point, Clara. Some mistakes don't get do-overs. Some trust, once broken, can't be repaired. Some relationships, once destroyed, can't be rebuilt." The judge called our case and we went through the final formalities of legally ending what had once been the most important relationship in both our lives. Signatures, stamps, official declarations that Marcus and Clara Hale were no longer married, no longer legally bound to each other, free to pursue separate futures. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. Genuine happiness. Not the bitter satisfaction of watching your enemies destroy themselves. Not the grim pleasure of being proven right about everything, but real honest-to-God happiness about what came next. I had a business that was thriving, friends who actually valued me for who I was instead of what I could provide, and for the first time in my adult life, a future that belonged entirely to me. 6 months later, I can honestly say that getting thrown out of that penthouse was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because I enjoyed the pain or the humiliation or the months of legal battles, but because it forced me to discover that I was stronger, smarter, and more capable than I'd ever given myself credit for. Clara's world collapsed because she built it on a foundation of other people's money and other people's lives. My new world is solid because I built it myself. One honest client relationship and one successful project at a time. And when I signed those final divorce papers, I didn't just end my marriage to Clara Whitmore. I began my life as Marcus Hale. And let me tell you, it's a hell of a lot better than anything I left behind.